At 67, after dedicating the decades of my life as a seamstress in Southside Atlanta, I never imagined that my absence from my son Ethan's wedding would be something to be celebrated, especially by my daughter-in-law, Tasha. It was as though my presence had been a burden she had eagerly shared. And as I stood on the edge of that realization, the weight of the situation hit me hard that morning. Just like every other since my husband Curtis passed away 15 years ago, I woke before the sun had even begun to rise. It had become a routine for me, this early silence, where I would prepare myself for another day of life, sometimes weary, but always forward moving. I had picked out my best navy blue dress for the wedding. It had taken me months to save for it, and I was determined to look my best. The dress was special, and I was proud of it. This was Ethan's wedding, the boy I had raised alone after Curtis tragically died in an accident when we were just in our 30s. It was a moment I had been waiting for, and I refused to let any small hurdle stop me from making it to the ceremony. I pressed the dress carefully, just as I had done with countless others over the years, and checked the gift and intricate, hand-embroidered set of sheets that I had prepared for him. 2 months of labor went into that gift, working each night after finishing my daily orders. It was my way of showing love, my way of sharing what little I had, but things went awry that day. The burst of a main water pipe on Clover Lane had flooded the area and shut down all the roads leading to the church. Firefighters had closed off entire blocks, forcing me to take unfamiliar back streets. My neighbor, Dilea, called out from her window, "Grace, you won't get out that way. It's all blocked off." I had no choice but to walk 15 blocks in my high heels until a taxi finally agreed to take me the long way around. By the time I reached the First Metropolitan Baptist Church, the ceremony had already concluded. I was late, but I wasn't about to turn around now. This was my son's wedding. I wandered through the venue, searching for the reception hall, but I ended up at the back of the building, by a small garden where bridesmaids were resting between photos. That's when I overheard Tasha, my daughter-in-law, talking with her friends Kendra and Candace. I stood frozen behind a bush as their voices reached my ears. Thank goodness she missed the ceremony. You know how Grace is always talking about how hard it was raising Ethan on her own. It's just better this way, isn't it? Tasha's voice carried the words with a sharpness I wasn't used to hearing. Kendra chimed in, "Oh, mothers-in-law are always like that. They think their stories are so important." Candace added, "Can you imagine if she showed up in that old dress? It's better she stayed away." No need for the poor me drama. I stood there, the words searing through me like an icy jolt. Old dress. I had saved for months to get that dress. The same dress that had taken hours of care and thought to select, hoping it would reflect how much I loved my son. Poor me drama. For 2 years, I had supported Ethan and Tasha financially, scraping together my savings to help with their down payment for their condo. I had worked every night, saving a little more each day, while still giving them what I could to make their life easier. And this is how they saw me? I took a deep breath and smoothed the wrinkles from my dress. There was no time for tears. I had come here for one reason, to support my son, no matter how hard this day had already been. As I walked into the reception hall, Ethan spotted me from across the room. "Mom, you made it," he said, his arms wide open, and I rushed into his embrace, thankful for his warmth, for his familiar scent. His cologne, his suit, everything was new, polished, and elegant. I had to be here. "Ethan, there was no way I was missing your wedding," I said, the smile on my face a quiet mask for the storm that churned inside. Tasha approached, her smile cold and practiced. "Mother Pyle, such a shame you missed the ceremony." It was beautiful. I kissed her on the cheek, fighting the overwhelming urge to retreat into myself. "What matters is that you're married now. God bless you both." Throughout the evening, something shifted. I had been ignored by relatives I had once been close to. Simone, my sister-in-law, introduced me to guests as Ethan's mom, but whenever the conversation turned to me, she'd quickly change the topic or steer the guests away. My nephew Devon barely greeted me before disappearing into the crowd. My nieces, who used to cling to me at family events, now barely acknowledged my presence before finding an excuse to leave when it was time for the gifts. I watched as Tasha's family exchanged genuine excitement over their lavish presents. But when Ethan opened my gift-embroidered sheets, something I had poured my heart into Tasha immediately lifted it up, muttered a hasty, "Thanks, mother pile," and placed it beneath the table as if it was an afterthought. It wasn't just a dismissive comment from Tasha anymore. It was clear my role in their life had shifted. I wasn't the woman who had sacrificed everything to make their lives better. I wasn't the woman who had worked through nights, stitching every scene with love. I was an inconvenience now, outdated, a relic of Ethan's past that no longer fit into the polished life he had built. As the evening wore on, the gap between us grew wider. I found myself sitting at a table with distant relatives of Tasha's. They were polite but kept their distance. From across the room, I saw Ethan and Tasha surrounded by their friends, all professionals, talking about investments, luxury trips, restaurants I didn't recognize. They were speaking a language I didn't understand. I felt like a ghost, slowly fading into the background. The night dragged on. The music blared, the younger guests took over the dance floor, and I waited for Ethan to come over and ask me to dance, just like he had at family gatherings in the past. But he didn't. He was completely absorbed in his new life with Tasha and their friends. When it was finally time to leave, I went over to Ethan. "Son, I'm heading out now. I have to work early tomorrow," I said, giving him a quick hug. He gave me a distracted embrace, barely looking up from the conversation he was having with Tasha. "Already leaving, Mom?" "Okay, have a good night. Thanks for coming." Tasha gave me an equally dismissive kiss on the cheek. "Thanks for coming, Mother Pile. See you soon." But in her eyes I saw the truth. She was relieved I was leaving. It was as though the perfect evening could continue without the awkward presence of the humble mother-in-law who didn't quite fit in with their modern, prosperous lives. The cab ride home was a long, silent one. The city lights blurred past the window as I replayed the events of the night over and over. It wasn't just the cold comments from Tasha or the way my gift had been dismissed. It was everything. The distance, the discomfort, the way I had been an afterthought in the wedding of my only son. I began to wonder if I had ever really mattered in their lives, or if I had just been filling a role of mother who was useful only when it suited them. As the car made its way through the familiar streets of Southside, I found myself thinking about all the sacrifices I had made for Ethan, the long nights working in my little sewing corner, the years of double shifts to pay for his schooling when public schools didn't offer the education I wanted for him. I had given him everything, and now I was left with this cold, distant feeling that maybe I had been doing it all wrong. Maybe I had poured too much into him and not enough into myself. I arrived home just past midnight, and as I stepped into my quiet apartment, it felt emptier than ever. The memories that once filled the walls, photographs of Ethan as a child, his school trophies, the little notes he used to leave me saying "I love you, Mom," now felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else's life. I made my way to the kitchen, brewed some tea, and sat down, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands as I tried to calm my racing thoughts. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the table. It was a text from Ethan, asking if I was okay and if I had gotten home safely. He always asked, and part of me still appreciated that he cared enough to check on me. But it felt more like an obligation now. I sent him a quick reply, telling him I was fine. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently. Ethan's calls were shorter. The visits were less frequent, and when he did come by, it was with Tasha, always rushing, always moving to the next thing. It wasn't just physical space that had grown between us, it was emotional distance. A gap I wasn't sure how to bridge. And then there were the little things, comments from Tasha that now felt more like critiques than advice. Grace, have you thought about getting a more modern hairstyle? You know, something shorter would suit your face. At first, I'd brushed it off as harmless, even well-intentioned advice. But now, with everything else weighing on my heart, those words took on a different meaning. Tasha wasn't just offering suggestions. She was subtly trying to reshape me, to make me fit into their world, a world I no longer felt a part of. I had spent so many years of my life trying to be what others needed me to be, always there, always available, always willing to sacrifice. And for what? To be left behind, forgotten when I wasn't needed. That night, as I sat in my favorite rocking chair, the weight of it all came crashing down. I wasn't just a mother. I was a woman with my own needs, my own life to live. And yet, here I was pushing those parts of myself aside to make room for people who didn't even truly see me anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, restless and frustrated. When I finally got up, I moved through the house in the dark, taking in the space I had filled with memories of Ethan's childhood. It was hard to admit, but I was grieving not just the loss of my husband, Curtis, but the loss of my role in Ethan's life. I was no longer the central figure in his world. I had become an accessory, useful when needed, but out of place when it came to their new life. The next morning, I woke up with a decision in my mind. I needed to make changes, to stop waiting for Ethan's approval to live my life. I had spent decades doing everything for him, and now I had to start doing things for myself. It wasn't going to be easy. Letting go of the role I had played in his life for so long would take time. But I was determined to try. I spent the following week rearranging things in my home. I shifted the furniture in the living room, turning it into a space that felt more like me, no longer a room where I waited for Ethan to visit, but a place where I could sit in peace, without constantly thinking about what they might need from me. I even moved my sewing table, creating a space where I could work on personal projects, but it wasn't just the physical changes that mattered. It was the emotional shift I was making. For the first time, I started thinking about what I wanted, not just what others needed from me. I had always been there for my family, putting them first, and now I was learning to put myself on that list. That Friday, I decided to take the first step toward reclaiming my independence. I enrolled in a community center computer class, something I had been meaning to do for years, but had never had the time for. It was small, but it felt like a big step toward a new me, one who wasn't defined solely by her family obligations. As I sat in the computer class, learning the basics of email and internet navigation, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. It wasn't just about technology. It was about opening up to new possibilities. There was so much I had put off in life, waiting for the right time, waiting for my family to need me. But now I was taking the time for me, and it felt liberating. Later that week, I received a message from Tasha asking me to join her family for a small lunch. The old me would have eagerly accepted, excited at any opportunity to be included in their life. But this time, something had changed. I had plans for the day, plans that were for me. I politely declined, telling her I already had something scheduled. At first, I was nervous about how she would react. But when I didn't hear back immediately, I realized I didn't care. For once, my life didn't revolve around their needs or expectations. And that felt like a victory. The days that followed felt strangely freeing. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Ethan's call or wondering when Tasha would ask for my help. I wasn't measuring my worth by the time I spent making their lives easier. I had stopped allowing my life to be dictated by their needs, and instead, I started building a life for myself, one that didn't revolve around their expectations. Each day, I felt a little lighter, a little freer. It wasn't that I didn't love my son anymore or that I no longer cared about his happiness. It was simply that I had realized I couldn't live my entire life for someone else. I was not just a mother. I was Grace, a woman with desires, dreams, and a future of my own. One afternoon, I decided to spend the entire day doing something that I had put off for far too long, working on an embroidery project for myself. I had always used my craft to create gifts for others, but this time it was about creating something that was purely for my own enjoyment. No deadlines, no obligations. Just me, my needles, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my hands. As I worked, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing. I wasn't doing this for anyone else's approval. I was doing it because I enjoyed it. I had spent so many years running on autopilot, constantly thinking about how I could help others, how I could fit into their lives, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist for myself. But now, in my little sewing studio, I remembered, later that evening, I received a message from Ethan. He asked if I was free to join him and Tasha for dinner the following weekend. In the past, I would have dropped everything for an opportunity to spend time with them. But this time, I hesitated. I had plans for the weekend. For the first time, those plans didn't revolve around them. When I finally replied, I told him that I had already made plans for the weekend, and I wouldn't be able to join them. His response was casual, but I could sense the surprise in his tone. He didn't argue or try to convince me otherwise. It was as though he was processing the fact that, for the first time, I had set a boundary that had nothing to do with him, but everything to do with me. This small act felt like a victory, but it also brought a wave of guilt. It was strange, setting boundaries after so many years of self-sacrifice. But I knew it was necessary. I couldn't keep putting my life on hold for a family dynamic that no longer served me. And as I stood by the phone, looking out the window at the quiet street, I realized something profound. My self-worth no longer hinged on their approval. The following Sunday, I spent the day in my own way, visiting a local art gallery. It was an outing I had planned on my own, without checking with anyone. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything. I had filled my life with things that brought me joy, not because I was trying to fill the emptiness of waiting for them to need me, but because I was discovering my own desires and interests. In the gallery, I found myself lost in the beauty of the art, something I had neglected in my busy years of motherhood and caregiving. As I admired a painting that captured the calm of the sea at dawn, I realized that I had been living a life defined by others, first by Curtis, then by Ethan, and now by Tasha. But here, in this quiet space filled with creativity, I was reclaiming my own. That evening, when I returned home, I received a call from Tasha. She asked me if I had received her message about dinner, and I politely confirmed that I had. She hesitated before asking, "Is everything okay, Grace?" For a moment, I wasn't sure how to answer. Was everything okay? Yes, it was. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly worried about how they were doing or if they needed me. I had created a space for myself, a space that didn't revolve around my role as their mother or mother-in-law. "I'm fine, Tasha," I said, my voice steady. "I've just been focusing on some personal things lately. I'm enjoying my time." There was a pause before she replied, "I see. Well, I hope you're doing okay." Her words were polite, but I could tell there was an underlying tension. I wasn't the convenient mother-in-law anymore, the one who dropped everything at their beck and call. And though I could sense the discomfort in her voice, I also realized that this was a shift I needed to make. As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. I wasn't upset. I wasn't angry. I was simply living my life. The guilt that had once consumed me for not constantly being available had slowly faded. It had been replaced by a new sense of calm, of knowing that I was worthy of love and respect on my own terms. not because I could offer something material or sacrifice my own happiness over the next few weeks. I continued to explore my newfound independence. I took a class on computer skills at the community center, something I had always been curious about but never made time for. I started reading books I had put off for years, focusing on subjects I had always found fascinating but never had time to explore. I even began planning a trip to Charleston to visit my sister Maya, something I had always wanted to do but never allowed myself to prioritize, and with every passing day, I felt the distance between me and the old version of myself, the one who was defined only by her role in her family, grow wider. I was becoming someone new, someone who was allowed to have her own life, her own dreams, and her own future. As the weeks went by, my sense of independence deepened. The changes I was making, both external and internal, started to manifest in ways I hadn't expected. What I had once seen as sacrifices for my family and questioned acts of devotion now began to feel like expectations that I was no longer willing to meet at the expense of my own well-being. The emotional weight I had carried for so many years was slowly lifting, and in its place, I was finding peace. I had always been a woman who measured her life by the needs of others. When I was a young wife, it was about Curtis. After his death, it became all about Ethan. Raising him alone after Curtis's tragic passing had been both my duty and my purpose, but as Ethan grew older, moved out, and married, I began to wonder where I fit into this new life. I had put so much energy into being his mother, his sole support system, that I had lost sight of myself. But now, as I sat in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the things that mattered to me, I finally understood what was missing. My conversations with my sister-in-law Simone and my neighbors made it clear that I wasn't alone in this struggle. Many women my age were facing similar dilemmas: the quiet retreat of their children as they built their own lives, the unspoken shift in roles as they became secondary in their children's eyes. For so long, I had been fighting this invisible battle, feeling like I was being edged out of my son's life. But in the silence of my own home, I realized that this didn't have to be a fight. It could be a transformation, a rebirth of sorts. It wasn't long before my sense of self-worth started to strengthen. I no longer measured my value by the role I played in Ethan's life. Instead, I began to measure it by the life I was building for myself, and that shift was liberating. I was discovering new passions, making new connections, and experiencing things I had long put off. I continued with my computer classes, which were now more than just a way to pass time. They had become a symbol of my independence, a quiet rebellion against the years I had spent living solely for others. I was learning, growing, and enjoying it. For the first time, I wasn't doing something for someone else's benefit. I was doing it for me. One day, as I sat in the community center, practicing my typing skills and focusing on an email to my sister Maya, I received a call from Ethan. It had been a few weeks since we'd spoken in person, and I had kept my distance from the routine visits. I wasn't avoiding him, I just didn't feel the need to be constantly available. He had called to ask if I was free for lunch, and for a moment I hesitated. In the past, I would have dropped everything. But now I had plans, I had things I wanted to do, and those plans didn't involve waiting for him to ask me to join him. I took a deep breath and answered the phone. "Mom, I was thinking we could have lunch this weekend. Just the two of us. What do you think?" Ethan asked, his voice warm, but with a slight edge of uncertainty. I could tell he wasn't used to me turning down his requests. "I'd love to, Ethan," I said, surprising myself, but I already have plans for this weekend. I've got a few things lined up that I'm looking forward to. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Oh, okay, well, we can do it another time. No problem at all, sweetheart," I said gently. "I'm really glad you called, though we'll find a time soon." As I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, I had prioritized myself without guilt. I hadn't ignored Ethan or shut him out, but I had placed a boundary, a healthy, loving boundary. This wasn't about rejecting him. It was about teaching both of us that I was more than just his mother. I was Grace, and I deserved to have a life outside of his. The shift wasn't immediate. There were still moments when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if I was becoming a distant, uncaring mother. But then I remembered the look in Ethan's eyes when he had asked me to go to lunch, the confusion, the surprise that I wasn't immediately available, and I realized that, in a way, this was exactly what needed to happen. He was learning that I had my own life. I wasn't always going to be the constant, dependable figure I once was, but that didn't mean I loved him any less. I spent the rest of the weekend exactly as I had planned. I went for a long walk through the Southside Greenway Park, enjoying the rhythm of my body in motion, the fresh air in my lungs. I even made a new friend there, a woman named Beatrice, who was also learning to find her own way after the loss of her husband. We exchanged stories about our lives, and I felt a sense of camaraderie that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by my role as someone's mother or someone's wife. I was just me, Grace, living for myself. That evening, I attended a local art exhibit showcasing works from older artists, many of whom had only begun their craft after retirement. It was inspiring to see so many people reinventing themselves, discovering new passions in their later years. As I walked through the exhibit, taking in the beauty of the art, I felt a deep sense of pride in my own journey. I had spent decades nurturing others, but now it was my turn to nurture myself. The phone call from Ethan later that night didn't surprise me. But this time, it was different. He wasn't asking for my time, he was simply checking in to see how I was doing. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, his voice warmer than it had been in weeks. "I was just calling to see how you're doing. We missed you at dinner last weekend." "I'm doing well, Ethan. Just keeping busy," I replied, feeling a strange sense of contentment. "I've got some new things I'm working on, which is exciting." "Good, that's great to hear," he said. "We'll catch up soon." "I'm looking forward to it," I said, smiling to myself. As I hung up, I reflected on how far I had come. What had once felt like a painful separation from my son now felt like a natural evolution. I wasn't losing him. I was letting him grow, and in doing so, I was allowing myself to grow too. It had been a few months since I had started embracing this new chapter of my life. Each day felt like a small step toward freedom from the old, ingrained patterns of my past, freedom from living my life solely for others. There were still moments when I felt the pull of guilt, when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing by distancing myself from Ethan and Tasha, but the more I experienced this newfound independence, the clearer it became that I was on the right path. One evening, as I sat in my sewing room, now a space transformed into my personal sanctuary, I noticed how peaceful it had become. The once cluttered room was now neatly arranged, filled with fabric and threads, and my personal projects took center stage. No longer was I stitching together gifts for others to feel needed. Now I was stitching for myself, creating works of art that represented who I was becoming. It was a small change, but one that made a world of difference. That night, while I worked on a new embroidery pattern, I heard the familiar buzz of my phone. It was a message from Tasha, asking if I was available for lunch the following week. I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Over the last few months, I had become accustomed to saying no without guilt. But it was different with Tasha. She was still the daughter-in-law I had hoped to bond with, and part of me wanted to accept, to fit into her world in a way I had once done. But as I looked at my half-finished embroidery, I realized something. I didn't need to prove myself to her. I didn't need to be the mother-in-law who dropped everything for a lunch date. For the first time, I felt no obligation to respond immediately. I wasn't avoiding her, but I wasn't waiting for her approval either. I took a deep breath and replied, "Thank you for the invitation. Tasha, I'm actually going to be tied up with some personal projects next week. I hope you understand. A part of me expected her to be upset, but I didn't hear from her for the rest of the day. And strangely, that felt freeing. It was as though I had taken control of my own space, and I didn't need anyone to validate my decisions. I wasn't being rude or rejecting her, I was simply living my life on my own terms. In the days that followed, I continued with my classes, my embroidery projects, and my daily walks. I was rediscovering the world around me, noticing things I had long ignored. One afternoon, while walking through the park, I came across a group of women in their 60s and 70s, gathering for a community art class. They were laughing, chatting about their projects, and it reminded me of my own transformation. I approached the group hesitantly, unsure of how to join in, but they welcomed me with open arms. It turned out that they were part of a local artist collective, and they invited me to attend their next meeting. These women, all of them much older than I was, were living proof that it was never too late to embrace new beginnings. They had found their passions later in life, just as I was finding mine. At the next meeting, I sat with them, sharing stories about my embroidery work and listening to their journeys. It was refreshing to be around people who understood what it meant to reinvent yourself, to carve out a space where you were valued for your passions, not just your role in someone else's life. And as I listened to their stories, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone in this. There were other women like me, rediscovering their independence and learning to live for themselves. That evening, I received a call from Ethan. He sounded different. More thoughtful than usual. "Hey, Mom," he began, his voice softer than it had been in recent weeks. "How are you doing? I've been thinking about you a lot lately." I could tell he wasn't just making small talk. There was a sincerity in his voice that I hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm doing well, Ethan," I said, smiling at the phone. "I've been keeping busy with a lot of things. I've started meeting some new people, doing some things for myself." "That's great," he replied, pausing for a moment. "Tasha and I were talking, and we've noticed some changes in you. You seem happier, more at peace." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Well, Ethan, I've been focusing on my own happiness," I said slowly, feeling the weight of the words. "For so long, I lived for everyone else. But now I'm learning to live for myself. And it feels really good." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the shift in his voice. He was processing what I had said. "I get it," he finally said, his voice more reflective. "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. I realize now that I haven't always been as considerate as I should have been. I guess I didn't really see you, Mom, not for who you are, but just for what you could do for me." The weight of his words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first time in a long while that Ethan had acknowledged the shift between us. "I understand, Ethan," I said quietly, "and I'm not angry with you. I just needed to find my own space, you know. And I'm glad you're starting to see that." We continued to talk for a little while longer, but there was something different in our conversation. It wasn't the same as it used to be, filled with my constant need to make sure he was okay. Instead, it felt more like two adults connecting in a new, more honest way. That night, as I sat at my sewing table, finishing up a project for myself, I realized that my relationship with Ethan had changed. It wasn't the same as it used to be, but it didn't need to be. It was evolving, just like I was. And for the first time, I felt okay with that. As the days turned into weeks, my life took on a rhythm that was distinctly mine. I wasn't living for anyone else's approval or validation. Every choice, whether it was taking an art class, going on a spontaneous trip, or simply spending a quiet evening at home, was made for me and no one else. I could feel the transformation in my bones. No longer was I just Grace, the mother. I was Grace, the woman, with a voice, a purpose, and a future I was actively shaping. One of the most significant changes was in how I viewed my relationship with Tasha. For so long, I had tried to fit into her world, desperately hoping for her approval, hoping that if I did enough, sacrificed enough, she would see me as worthy. But now I realized that I didn't need to prove myself to her. I didn't need to shrink myself into a mold that didn't fit just to belong. I was already worthy of respect, of love, simply because I was Grace whole and enough in my own right, and yet Tasha's presence in my life was still important. I didn't want to sever the bond with her. I knew I needed to find a way to coexist in a space where both of us could be independent, while still maintaining a connection. But it wouldn't be on her terms. It had to be on mine. One afternoon, as I was walking to the market to buy some fabric for a new project, I ran into Tasha. She was just leaving a coffee shop, looking as polished and put together as always. For a moment, I hesitated. Was she going to look at me with that familiar judgment? Would she try to mask her discomfort with a polite smile? But then I realized this wasn't about her. This was about me. It was about the space I had created for myself and how I moved in it. "Hey, Grace," she called out, her voice a little more upbeat than I expected. "How have you been?" "I've been good," I replied, smiling at her, but not overdoing it. I was calm, centered, just keeping busy with my embroidery and some new projects. "That's great," she said, but I could see the slight tension in her eyes. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly warm either. Still, I didn't feel the usual pang of insecurity that I had once felt whenever we had these brief interactions. I wasn't trying to make her like me anymore. I didn't need her to. She shifted her weight on her feet before continuing. "We've been talking about visiting you sometime soon. You know, to catch up." She said it more as a formality than anything else. Her words didn't carry the same weight of expectation they once had. And that was okay. I was okay with it. "I'd like that," I said, maintaining a neutral tone. "Let me know when you're free." "I'm around." As Tasha left, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. There was no awkwardness, no desperation to make her see me in a different light. I didn't need her approval. She could come when she wanted to on her terms or mine. But either way, I was at peace with who I was. The following week, I received a call from Simone, my sister-in-law. It was unexpected, and I wondered for a moment what prompted her to reach out. Simone and I had never been close, but over the years, I had tried to forge a connection with her, only to feel that cold barrier she always put up between us. She had been one of the first to pull away at Ethan's wedding, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was another attempt to distance herself from me. But when I answered the phone, her tone was different. "Grace, I've been thinking," Simone said hesitantly. "I wanted to invite you to Devon's communion next month. I know we've had our differences, but I thought it might be nice to, well, reconnect a little." Her words surprised me. I had expected the usual excuse, the brush off or the veiled judgment. But instead, there was a hint of sincerity in her voice, a willingness to meet me halfway. It was small, but it was a start. "I appreciate the invite, Simone," I said thoughtfully. "Let me check my schedule, and I'll get back to you." As I hung up, I found myself reflecting on the shift that had occurred not just in my relationship with Ethan and Tasha, but with the entire family. I was no longer the woman who was always waiting to be invited, to be included. I was now the one making the decision, setting the boundaries, choosing how I wanted to interact with them. And it felt empowering. That weekend, I attended my community art class, where I was starting to make real progress. I had never considered myself much of an artist, but I found joy in the freedom of creating something beautiful without the pressure of expectations. The group of women I had met there had become my new support system. They were all navigating their own journeys of reinvention, just as I was. and we shared stories of the challenges and triumphs that came with this stage of life. The class was where I had begun to rediscover myself not as someone's mother or someone's wife, but as Grace, the woman who had spent years giving everything for others, now learning to live for herself. And there was something magical about that transformation. The art we created was symbolic of the life I was beginning to build, a life that was just for me. That evening, as I worked on a new embroidery pattern, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the changes I had made. I wasn't perfect, and I wasn't pretending to be, but I was finally at peace with the person I had become, and that peace felt like a gift that no one could take away from me. The following weeks were marked by a deepening of my journey toward independence. I had slowly built a life that no longer depended on being needed by others. It was a liberating feeling, but it came with its own challenges. As much as I had embraced the changes, there were still moments when I longed for the closeness I had once shared with my family. I had to remind myself that the relationships I was cultivating now were just as valid, just as meaningful, and far more balanced. One Thursday evening, I received a text message from Beatrice, the woman I had met at the park during one of my walks. She invited me to join her and a few of her friends for a weekend hike through a nearby nature reserve. It was something I never would have considered before, taking time for myself in nature, away from my daily routine. But this time, I found myself excited at the prospect. I had been spending so much time in the quiet comfort of my home, working on my embroidery or studying for my computer class, that I had forgotten how much I loved the outdoors. The hike was everything I had hoped for. The cool air, the rustling of the leaves, the gentle conversation with Beatrice and the others. It was a rare chance to be away from everything and just be. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was rushing to meet someone's needs. I didn't have to think about my role as a mother, a daughter-in-law, or any of the other roles I had been conditioned to fill for so many years. In that moment, I was simply Grace, present and content. During the hike, Beatrice shared stories of her own experiences with her children, and it felt comforting to know I wasn't alone in this process of reinvention. She spoke of how, after her husband passed away, she had dedicated herself entirely to her children, just as I had done for Ethan, and now, at 73, she was learning to live for herself again. Her story echoed mine in so many ways, and it filled me with hope for the future. "You know, Grace," Beatrice said, as we paused for a moment to take in the view, "the hardest part isn't about letting go of the role as a mother. It's about realizing that you still have a lot to give to the world, just not in the way you thought." Her words hit me like a wave, and for the first time, I felt a profound sense of peace. She was right. I still had so much to offer, but it wasn't tied to the way I had always given. I had learned to step back and let go of the constant need to be needed, and in doing so, I was opening myself up to new opportunities and connections that had nothing to do with my identity as a mother. As we finished the hike, I realized that I had been so focused on my relationship with Ethan and Tasha that I had neglected other parts of myself, the parts that loved nature, the parts that longed for connection with people who were not bound by familial expectations. Beatrice had reminded me that I didn't have to limit my world to one circle, to one role. There was a whole universe of experiences waiting for me to discover. The next day, I received a call from Simone. She sounded different than usual, less formal, more open. "Grace," she said, her voice hesitant but warm, "I just wanted to let you know that I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I realized that we've been kind of distant for a while. I'd really like to change that." I was taken aback. Simone had always been so guarded with me, and for her to reach out like this felt like a significant shift. "I'd like that too, Simone," I replied, my heart opening to the possibility of rebuilding that connection. We agreed to meet for lunch the following week, and as I hung up, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. This wasn't going to be an overnight transformation, but it was progress. Over the years, I had tried so hard to fit into Simone's world, to earn her approval, but now it felt like we were meeting each other halfway. It was a sign that the changes I had made in myself were beginning to ripple out, slowly but surely. That weekend, I continued to focus on myself. I spent the morning at the community centre, where I was helping teach an embroidery workshop for other women in my age group. I had come a long way from the woman who had once felt invisible at family gatherings. Now I was a teacher, a mentor, and a source of inspiration for others. And as I stood at the front of the room, guiding my students through a particularly intricate stitch, I realized that I had become something I had never expected to be, a woman with something to give. Not out of obligation, but out of passion and experience. As the workshop ended, one of the women approached me. "Grace, I just wanted to say how much I appreciate what you're doing here. You're not just teaching us embroidery. You're teaching us to embrace life at any age. You make us feel like we can still create, still grow, and still have a purpose." Her words struck me deeply, and I couldn't help but smile. This was the life I had been searching for, the one where I could contribute not because I was expected to, but because I had something valuable to share. That night, as I sat alone at my dining table, eating a simple meal and reflecting on the day, I realized how far I had come. It wasn't just about the external changes, the way my relationship with Ethan had shifted, or the new connections I had made with people like Beatrice. It was about how I had come to see myself. I was no longer the woman who lived to serve others. I was a woman who lived for herself, who made her own choices, who created a life filled with meaning and purpose. It had been months since I started my journey toward independence, and with each passing day, I felt stronger, more centered in myself. I was no longer living in the shadow of past roles or constantly seeking validation from those. Round V. I had learned to cherish my own company, to respect my own boundaries, and to take pride in my life, separate from the expectations that had once defined me. The changes I had made were profound. Not just on the surface, but deep within. My relationship with Ethan and Tasha had shifted. Yes, but it wasn't about severing ties or abandoning them. It was about understanding that my value wasn't tied to my ability to cater to their every need. And surprisingly, I had seen their perspectives shift as well. Ethan had been calling more regularly. Our conversations weren't just about his work or Tasha's latest project. He was starting to ask about me, about my new activities, about my personal projects, about the things I was learning. It felt like a small victory. Like he was finally seeing me as more than just his mother. More than just the woman who had spent her life serving his needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One morning, while I was working on a new embroidery piece for a community project, the phone rang. It was Tasha, and for a moment I hesitated. Over the past months, our interactions had been brief, but today something felt different. She had been reaching out less, and part of me wondered if she had finally accepted the distance I had set. When I picked up the phone, her voice sounded softer than usual. "Grace, I've been meaning to call," she began, her tone tentative. "I was thinking about how we left things, and I want to apologize if I made you feel like you weren't important or welcome. I didn't mean to." I was silent for a moment, taken aback by her words. Apologies weren't something I had expected from Tasha, especially not after the way she had dismissed me at the wedding. But there was sincerity in her voice, something I hadn't heard before. "I appreciate that, Tasha," I said, my voice calm but honest. "I know it's been a process for both of us. I've been working on setting some boundaries, and it's not always easy. But I think it's been good for all of us." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could sense her processing what I had said. Finally, she spoke again. "I've noticed the changes in you, Grace, and I think I get it now. It's not about pushing you away, it's about understanding that you have your own life, your own space, and I respect that her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Tasha and I had always had a complicated relationship, but in that moment, it felt like we were both acknowledging something that had been unspoken for so long. We weren't the perfect mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but we were finding a way to coexist with mutual respect. I appreciate that, Tasha, I said, my voice softening. I really do. I'm still here for you and Ethan, but I'm also learning to take care of myself. And that's okay, I understand, she replied, her voice warmer now. I think we're both learning how to navigate this new phase, but I'm glad we're talking. I am too, I said. A sense of peace washing over me, and I'm glad you reached out. As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel burdened by the expectations I had once carried. I wasn't living my life for Tasha, for Ethan, or for anyone else. I was living for me. And in that process, I had found peace. The next few weeks brought more quiet growth. I continued with my classes, attended more community events, and spent time with the women from my embroidery group. I was learning new things every day. Not just about embroidery, but about myself. I had become a woman who was unafraid to put herself first, unafraid to embrace her own worth, unafraid to let go of the need to prove herself to others. One evening, as I walked through the park, I ran into Beatrice again. She was sitting on a bench, enjoying the last rays of sunlight. I joined her, and we talked about our latest projects, the challenges we had faced, and the joys of doing things for ourselves. It was a simple conversation, but it felt meaningful in ways I couldn't fully express. I've been thinking a lot about what you said on our hike, Beatrice said, looking at me with a thoughtful expression, about how we can still create, still grow, no matter our age. You know, I didn't realize how much I had been holding onto the past until I started making space for myself. I know exactly what you mean, I replied, smiling at her. It's a process, but it's freeing, isn't it? Letting go of what others expect and just embracing who we are. It's more than freeing, she said, her eyes sparkling. It's life-changing. I never thought I'd be learning to paint at 73. But here I am, we both laughed, and I realized how much I had grown in just a few short months. I was learning to embrace life, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in my own journey. Later that week, I received a call from Simone. She was inviting me to a family gathering to celebrate Devon's communion. The old me might have felt obligated to go, even if I didn't feel truly welcome. But now I was different. I had learned to say no when I needed to set boundaries that prioritized my own well-being. I'd love to be there, Simone, I said, but I have plans that weekend. Let's catch up another time. Simone was quiet for a moment before responding. I understand, Grace, I really do. And I'm glad you're doing what's best for you. Her words were a small, quiet acknowledgement that things had shifted between us. It wasn't about rejecting family, but about creating space for ourselves and respecting each other's boundaries. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was letting anyone down. I was simply living my life. That night, I sat down to reflect on everything I had learned in these past months. I had embraced change, and in doing so, I had discovered a new version of myself, one that was free from the burden of living for others. I no longer defined myself by what I could do for people. I defined myself by who I was, by what I loved, by what brought me joy, and that in itself was a revolution. The days became more peaceful as I settled into this new chapter of my life. There was a calmness that had replaced the anxiety I once felt about being everything for everyone. I had stopped running around, trying to fulfill expectations that weren't mine to meet. Instead, I focused on building a life that was rooted in my own desires and needs. It wasn't selfishness, it was self-preservation. It had been 6 months since I made the conscious decision to stop living for others, and the changes had been profound. My relationships with Ethan and Tasha were evolving into something more respectful, more balanced. I had stopped waiting for their validation, and in doing so, I had found peace. They were still a part of my life, but they were no longer the center of it. I had become my own center one afternoon, while I was working on a new embroidery piece for a charity auction. I received an unexpected message from Ethan. It had been a while since we had talked in depth, and I wondered what prompted him to reach out. I picked up my phone, and his message read, "Mom, are you free tomorrow? I wanted to talk to you about something important." I felt a surge of curiosity. We had talked occasionally over the past few months, but nothing had felt urgent. The tone of his message felt different. It was more serious. I texted him back, "Of course, Ethan, what's going on?" The next day, he called. I could tell by the sound of his voice that he was nervous. "Hey, Mom, I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he began, his tone tentative. "Not at all. Ethan, what's on your mind?" I asked, sitting down in my sewing chair. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice becoming more measured. "About everything. About you. About us." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. This was different. Ethan wasn't usually the type to open up like this, especially not about things that made him uncomfortable. I listened carefully, allowing him the space to speak. I've realized that I haven't been as understanding as I should have been. I've always expected you to be there for me, without thinking about what you need, he continued. And I guess I didn't understand how much you've changed, how much you've been working on yourself. I just want you to know that I see it now. His words were like a bomb to a wound I hadn't realized I had been nursing. Over the years, I had given everything to him physically, emotionally, financially, and for so long, I had done it without question, without expecting anything in return. But hearing him acknowledge my efforts, hearing him recognize my growth, felt like a quiet victory. "Ethan, I appreciate that," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I've spent so much of my life focused on you, on making sure you had everything you needed. But I had to come to terms with the fact that I can't just live for you anymore. I have to live for myself." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and I could hear him processing my words. "I get it, Mom," he said, his voice quieter now. "I really do. And I think I understand why you've been doing what you've been doing. I guess I didn't fully get it before, but now I do. I want you to be happy. I want you to live for yourself." I could feel a lump forming in my throat, but I didn't want him to hear it. This was the moment I had waited for, the moment I had hoped for, the moment when my son finally understood that I was more than just his mother. I was a woman, with a life of my own, with needs and desires that didn't revolve around him. "I appreciate you saying that, Ethan," I replied, my voice steady now. "It means a lot. And I want you to know that I'm still here for you. But I'm also here for me." After a few more minutes of conversation, we hung up, and I sat there in the quiet of my sewing room, reflecting on the conversation. I had spent so many years waiting for this moment, hoping that Ethan would see me for who I was, not just who I had been in relation to him. And now it had finally come. It wasn't a grand gesture or an apology. It was simply recognition. The recognition that I had value beyond my role as his mother. The recognition that I, too, was entitled to happiness and independence. The next week, I received an invitation from Tasha. This time, it was different. Instead of a casual lunch invitation, she had written a heartfelt note, apologizing for her past behavior. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She acknowledged the distance that had grown between us and expressed her desire to reconnect, but on a more balanced level. She said she wanted to understand me, to see me for who I was, not just as a mother-in-law. I took a moment to let her words sink in. For so long, I had been waiting for her to see me, to recognize the sacrifices I had made for her and Ethan. But now I realized that the recognition I needed didn't come from her, it came from me. I had already given myself the permission to be seen, to be valued. Her apology was an added bonus, not the validation I had once craved. I replied with a simple, "Thank you, Tasha, I'd love to reconnect. Let's find a time that works for both of us." As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. I was no longer a woman defined by my role in others' lives. I had created my own identity, and in doing so, I had found a quiet strength that I never knew I had. My relationships were evolving not in dramatic, explosive ways, but in subtle shifts that reflected mutual respect and understanding. Ethan and Tasha were learning to see me for who I truly was, not just as a mother, not just as a caretaker. And in turn, I was learning to see myself as more than just their support system. I was Grace whole, independent, and enough. The more time I spent living for myself, the more I realized that the act of letting go of old expectations, of roles I had defined myself by for so many years, was not as painful as I had anticipated. Instead, it felt liberating. It was like stepping into a new season of life, where the pressure to please and fulfill others was no longer the driving force behind my every decision. It wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about giving myself the space to exist without constantly seeking approval or validation. One evening, I was sitting in my sewing room, working on a piece for an upcoming gallery exhibit. The soft hum of the needle as it worked through the fabric was soothing, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. For so many years, I had been stitching for others, creating beautiful pieces with the hope of being seen, being needed. But now, the act of creating was just for me. It was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of my time, my energy, my creativity. As I continued to work, I thought about the recent changes in my relationships. Particularly with Ethan, I had noticed a shift in the way he interacted with me. Our conversations had become more balanced, more thoughtful. It wasn't that he had changed overnight, but there was a new level of respect in his tone. A recognition that I wasn't just his mother, I was Grace, an individual with my own life and passions. The weekend before, we had gone out for lunch, and it had been one of the most genuine conversations we had in years. We had talked about everything: his work, my embroidery projects, his plans with Tasha, but this time, it wasn't just about him. It was a true exchange, a dialogue between two people who were learning how to relate to each other as adults, not just mother and son. The old dynamic was still there, of course, but it no longer defined us. And for the first time, I felt like he was seeing me not as a caretaker, not as a sacrifice, but as a person. That simple realization filled me with a quiet joy. Tasha, too, had reached out more often in the past few weeks. Our conversations were still awkward at times, but they were real. She had begun to express curiosity about my work, my hobbies, and my life outside of her and Ethan. There was no longer the uncomfortable politeness that used to fill the spaces between us. Now there was a slow but steady attempt at understanding, at seeing me as more than just the woman who raised her husband. I had learned something important through all of this. It wasn't about forcing people to see me differently. It was about showing up as my authentic self, setting boundaries, and allowing others to adapt to the changes in me. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. I had nothing to prove. My worth wasn't tied to what I could offer them. It was tied to who I was, who I had always been. Even if I hadn't fully recognized it until now, the real turning point came one evening when I received a text from Tasha. It was a simple message, but it felt like a breakthrough. "Grace, I've been thinking about everything, and I just want to say that I really admire what you're doing for yourself. I know I haven't always understood it, but I'm starting to get it. You deserve this time to focus on you, and I'm proud of you for doing it." I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. It was an unexpected acknowledgement, one that spoke volumes. It wasn't about her accepting me more, it was about her accepting me, without judgment, without trying to mold me into something else. She wasn't asking me to be anything different. She was simply recognizing my right to live my life the way I wanted. I replied with a simple, "Thank you, Tasha. That means more than you know." The following week, Ethan and Tasha invited me over for a casual dinner. In the past, I would have felt nervous about what to wear, what to bring, how to act to make sure everything went smoothly. But this time, I didn't feel any of that. I was going to their home, not as the obligatory mother or mother-in-law, but as Grace, a woman who had a full life of her own, who was no longer defined by her familial roles. When I arrived, Tasha greeted me with a warm smile, and Ethan seemed genuinely happy to see me. The awkwardness that had once filled our interactions had faded, replaced by something more authentic, something that felt like a true connection, however small. We talked about my latest project, and I could tell they were genuinely interested in it. It wasn't just polite chatter anymore. They were curious about me, my life, and my passions. For once, it wasn't about me just being there to serve them or to fulfill some unspoken need. It was about being present. Later that evening, as I sat in their cozy living room, I realized how much had changed. The old me, always putting others first, always seeking their approval, always sacrificing my own needs, was no longer who I was. I had stepped into a version of myself that was strong, independent, and content. And that felt like an achievement greater than any gift or approval I had once hoped for. As I made my way home that night, I reflected on how far I had come. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And not just living, but thriving in a life I had built for myself. There was still work to do, of course. My relationships with Ethan and Tasha were evolving, and that would take time. But now I could approach those relationships from a place of strength, not need. I no longer lived for their approval, and in turn, I found that I was finally able to embrace my role in their lives not as an obligation, but as a choice. The days grew longer, and the changes in me continued to unfold in ways I had never imagined. I wasn't just finding freedom in my personal space. I was beginning to see the world differently. My relationships with Ethan and Tasha had moved into a new realm of mutual respect, but the most important relationship was the one I was building with myself. It had taken years of self-sacrifice to get here, but for the first time in a long while, I could finally look at myself in the mirror without feeling the weight of expectations or regrets. One afternoon, while I was working on a new project, a large embroidery piece inspired by the traditions of different cultures, I received a call from Ethan. He had been calling more often lately, and our conversations had become less transactional and more genuine. I no longer felt like I was just the person he turned to when he needed something. We were learning to communicate as equals. "Mom," Ethan said when I picked up the phone, "I was thinking about our conversation a while ago, about how you've been making time for yourself. And I've realized something. I'm proud of you. I don't think I fully understood what you were doing until now, but I get it." His words were simple, but they hit me hard. I had spent so much time trying to be everything for him, trying to fulfill a role that was becoming outdated. Now he was acknowledging my growth. He was seeing me in a way that I had always hoped for but never expected to receive. It wasn't just about him telling me he was proud, it was about him recognizing my worth as a person, not just as his mother. "I'm glad you get it, Ethan," I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's not always easy, but it's important. And I'm learning to do it for myself, not just for anyone else." There was a pause on the other end, a moment where I could feel him processing my words. "I know, Mom, I just want you to know that I see you. I see you as more than just my mom. You're Grace, and you deserve to have your own life." It was a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For so long, I had felt like I was just someone who existed to serve others. And now, here was my son telling me he saw me as a complete person, separate from my role as his mother. After we hung up, I sat in my sewing room, looking at the embroidery I was working on. The colours and threads were vibrant, the design intricate, and as I worked, I realised something. This project, this piece of art, was a reflection of my own journey. Each stitch represented a step forward, each thread an individual decision I had made to honour myself. For the first time in a long time, I could say that I was creating something not just for others, but for me. A few days later, Tasha reached out. She invited me over to their place for dinner, something she had never done spontaneously before. It was always Ethan who extended the invitation, but this time it was her. I hesitated at first. Old habits die hard, but then I remembered how far I had come. I wasn't going because I felt obligated. I was going because I wanted to. When I arrived at their house, I was greeted warmly by both of them. Ethan and Tasha had been working on some home projects, and they were eager to show me their progress. For a moment, I felt that familiar tug of discomfort, the desire to please them, to be the good mother-in-law. But then I caught myself. I wasn't here to perform for anyone. I was here because I wanted to be. And that simple realization shifted everything. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about their work, about my latest embroidery projects, and about the changes in all of our lives. There was no tension, no undercurrent of expectations. It was just a relaxed, genuine exchange, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the work I had done on myself, for the space I had created for my own life, and for the way my relationship with them had shifted. After dinner, as we sat in their living room, Tasha spoke up. "Grace," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how you've made room for yourself. I guess I've always seen you as just, well, Ethan's mom. But I see now that there's so much more to you. And I just want to say I respect that. I respect you." Her words were a quiet revelation. I had never expected this from her, especially after all the awkwardness, the dismissiveness I had once felt. But here she was, acknowledging me as more than just a supporting character in their lives. She was seeing me for who I was. "I appreciate that, Tasha," I said, my voice steady. "I know it's been a process for both of us, but I'm glad we're finding our way." We sat in silence for a moment, and I realized that this moment wasn't about forgiveness or fixing everything. It was about acceptance. We were both acknowledging the space we had carved for ourselves, and the respect we had for each other was growing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The next few weeks were filled with more quiet moments of realization. I had learned to prioritize my own happiness without guilt, to put my own needs above the unspoken expectations of others. I spent more time pursuing my passions: embroidery, computer classes, and even taking short trips to visit old friends. I began to see that life was not about waiting for someone else to see my worth. It was about recognizing it myself. One afternoon, while I was at the local park, I ran into Beatrice again. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book, and when she saw me, she waved me over. We sat and talked about our lives, about the changes we had made, and the women we were becoming. It was a conversation I never would have had a few months ago, one where I wasn't just talking about my family or my role in their lives, but about who I was becoming outside of those roles, you know. "Grace," Beatrice said with a smile, "the hardest part isn't about letting go. It's about realizing that we still have so much to offer the world. And for the first time, I feel like I'm really living, not just existing." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked back to my car. I had spent so many years thinking that my life's purpose was to serve others, to be there when they needed me. But now I was discovering that my purpose could be something more. It could be about me, about living for my own fulfillment, about sharing my passions with the world, not because I was obligated, but because I had something valuable to offer. With every passing day, I found myself embracing a life that was uniquely mine. The woman I had been for so many years, devoted mother, supportive wife, the one who never said no, was slowly fading into the past. And in her place was a woman who knew her worth, who valued her own time, and who was beginning to build a future not just for others, but for herself. This newfound freedom was intoxicating, and as I stood in front of my mirror one morning, I could see the change reflected in my own eyes. It wasn't just about the independence I had gained in my day-to-day life, it was about the emotional independence I had fought so hard for. The ability to say no without guilt, the ability to prioritize my own needs, and most importantly, the ability to exist without seeking constant validation. I had begun to build a life that was fulfilling on its own terms, without needing to fit into a mold of expectations that others had placed on me. The phone call from Ethan that morning felt like a confirmation of how far I had come. He had been calling more often lately, and our conversations were deeper, more thoughtful. It was as if he had started to see me not just as his mother, but as the person I had always been, Grace. A woman with her own life, her own passions, her own voice. Mom, Ethan said, his voice carrying a sincerity that caught me off guard. I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing. I see how happy you are, and I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you. I've always known you were strong, but I think I'm just starting to realize how much strength it took for you to do what you've done. His words struck me deeply. I had always known that Ethan respected me, but hearing him say this, hearing him acknowledge my growth, felt like a validation I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't that I had done this journey for his approval, but it was nice to know that he understood the shift that had occurred in our relationship. Thank you, Ethan, I said, my voice calm but filled with emotion. It's been a long journey, but I'm finally learning to live for myself. And that feels good. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear him processing what I had said. I get it now, Mom, he said, his voice softer than usual. I really do. And I want you to know that I respect the space you've created for yourself. I can see how much it's changed you, and it's only made me realize how important it is for both of us to live our own lives, not just for each other. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent so many years trying to keep our relationship close, trying to make sure Ethan never felt neglected or unsupported. But now I realized that the closeness I had always longed for could only come when I allowed both of us the space to grow, to live independently, and to respect each other's individual paths. The conversation with Ethan gave me the strength I needed to continue focusing on my own journey. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was Grace, a woman with a rich inner world, with passions, dreams, and desires that were separate from my role as a parent. And for the first time in my life, I was embracing that truthfully. The following weekend, I spent the entire day at an art gallery, something I had always wanted to do, but had never prioritized. I marveled at the exhibits, spoke to fellow art lovers, and even bought a small piece for myself, a beautiful hand-painted vase that caught my eye. It was a symbol of the new chapter one was in, one where I made decisions based on my desires, not on what was expected of me. That evening, I returned home and felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't experienced in years. I had spent the day doing something just for me. I had made time to enjoy the things I loved without feeling guilty or apologetic for it. As I sat in my sewing room, reflecting on the day, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman I was becoming. I wasn't the same woman who had once been consumed by the needs of others. I wasn't the woman who had constantly put herself last. I was someone who had learned to embrace her own worth, her own desires, and her own journey. As the weeks passed, I continued to navigate this new life, one that was rich with possibility. I still had moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But each time I faced those doubts, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I had created a life that was truly mine, one that was not defined by the roles I had played for so long, but by the woman I had always been deep inside. Over time, I began to understand something profound about the nature of love and relationships. The love I had given for so many years, the sacrifices I had made, had been valuable, but it had never been enough to define me. Love was never meant to be a currency that I used to prove my worth. True love, the kind that lasted and deepened, was the love I had for myself. It was the love that allowed me to stand tall in my own space, to exist without apology, and to give to others not from a place of need, but from a place of abundance as I moved forward. I knew that my relationships with Ethan and Tasha would continue to evolve. They had already changed so much, and I was hopeful that they would continue to deepen in a way that honored each of us as individuals. But most importantly, I had come to understand that the foundation of any meaningful relationship had to start with self-respect, self-love, and a willingness to honor my own life. As the months continued to pass, I began to realize that I had finally reached a place of balance. It wasn't the kind of balance that meant everything was perfect or that all the pieces of my life were neatly aligned. No, it was a much deeper, more profound kind of balance, the balance between honoring my own life and respecting the relationships I had worked so hard to nurture. I had learned, through all the ups and downs, that I didn't have to choose between being a mother and being a woman. I didn't have to lose myself in the roles that others had expected of me. I could be both, and in doing so, I was creating the kind of relationship with Ethan, Tasha, and even with myself that was built on respect and understanding. One evening, as I sat at my sewing table, surrounded by the half-finished pieces that had become both my escape and my passion, I realized just how far I had come. These projects weren't just about creating something beautiful, they were about creating a new life for myself, one stitch at a time. I had turned my passion into a form of expression that allowed me to share my story with the world. And in doing so, I had reclaimed parts of myself that I had long forgotten. The phone rang, and I glanced at the screen. It was Ethan. I felt a familiar warmth in my chest as I answered. "Hey, Mom," Ethan said, his voice warm and steady. "Tasha and I were talking, and we'd love to have you over for dinner this weekend. Just the three of us. It's been a while, and we've been thinking about how much you've been there for us, even when we didn't fully see it." For a moment, I was speechless. Not because I was surprised it had been a long time coming, the understanding, the acceptance, but because the sincerity in his voice hit me harder than I expected. This wasn't just an invitation to dinner. This was an invitation to a new chapter of our relationship, one where I was no longer just the mother, but someone who was truly seen and appreciated for who I was. "I'd love that," I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan. I'm looking forward to it." The conversation continued, but I couldn't stop thinking about the shift in our dynamic. A few months ago, I would have eagerly accepted an invitation from him, desperate to please, to be needed. But now, it wasn't about that. It was about being invited into their lives because they genuinely wanted me there, not because they felt obligated to. As the weekend arrived, I found myself looking forward to dinner with a sense of calm anticipation. When I walked into their home, I was greeted with smiles and warmth. The awkwardness that had once lingered between us was gone. Instead, there was a sense of mutual respect, a recognition that we were all navigating this new phase together, and it didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. We spent the evening talking about our lives, mine, theirs, and everything in between. For once, it wasn't about the sacrifices I had made or the things I had done for them. It was about all of us as equals, sharing our experiences and learning from one another. I realized, as I looked at Tasha and Ethan, that they had grown just as much as I had. They had learned to see me, not just as their mother, but as Grace, a woman with a life of her own. Someone who had her own voice, her own passions, and her own journey. Later that night, after dinner, I sat outside on their porch, gazing up at the stars. The air was cool, and the night was quiet, except for the soft murmur of the wind. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. I had done it. I had carved out a life for myself, built on my own terms, and in doing so, I had not lost my family. I had gained a deeper connection with them, one that was based on understanding, respect, and love. It wasn't a dramatic ending, nor did it need to be. The real transformation had happened quietly, over time. It was in the small moments of self-realization, the quiet acts of self-care, the decisions to prioritize my own happiness without guilt. It was in the way my relationship with Ethan and Tasha had shifted from obligation to genuine connection. And it was in the way I had come to understand that love, in its truest form, is not about what we do for others, but about how we see and respect each other as individuals. As I reflected on the journey I had taken from the sacrifices I had made to the new life I was building, I understood something fundamental. It wasn't about giving up on my family, nor was it about running away from my responsibilities. It was about honoring myself, about teaching my family and myself that I was more than just the roles I played. I was graceful, independent, and loved for who I truly was, and so I continued to live. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I no longer feared it. I had found my place, not just in my family's life, but in the world. And that was enough.